A man with nothing, a billionaire with everything, and a battered titanium shell sitting in a field that neither of them understood yet. What happens when the thing everyone throws away turns out to be the thing that changes everything? This is a story about what it costs to see value where no one else will look, and what you find when you refuse to walk away. Drop a like, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The auction started at 8 in the morning, and by 9, Ethan Cross already wanted to leave. He stood at the outer edge of the crowd, maybe 60 people, maybe 70. All of them better dressed than him, all of them holding plastic auction paddles like they'd been born with them in their hands. He had no paddle. He'd filled out the registration form at the gate with a ballpoint pen that kept skipping, and the woman behind the folding table had looked at his credit card the way people look at something they're not sure is real before sliding it through the reader anyway. The card cleared. He got his number, 47, printed on a slip of paper that he folded twice and put in his back pocket. The field smelled like rust and old oil, and the particular kind of dried grass that only grows where something heavy has been sitting for a long time. Ransom Valley Aviation Estate sat about 40 minutes outside the city on what used to be a working airfield, and someone, probably the estate's previous owner, had spent 30 years collecting every piece of aerospace hardware they could get their hands on, and then died without leaving a will that anybody could fully interpret. Which was why all of it was now being sold on a Tuesday in October to whoever showed up. Ethan had shown up. He was 32 years old. He had a daughter named Cora, who was 7 and currently sitting in school drawing pictures of horses, which was her primary occupation outside of sleeping. He had a repair shop on the edge of an industrial district that he'd been running for 4 years, a space about the size of a large living room with good ventilation and bad lighting that he'd been slowly improving with clip-on LEDs from the hardware store. He had a truck that had 200,000 miles on it and had started making a sound last month that he was choosing to ignore. What he did not have was a lot of money. He'd come to Ransom Valley with $412 in his checking account, which meant he'd come with $412 total, because there was nothing in savings. He'd given himself permission to spend $250 at the auction. The remaining $162 was for groceries, Cora's field trip fee, and whatever the truck situation turned into. He wasn't here for the big items. He knew that going in. He'd looked at the estate catalog online the night before while Cora slept, eating a bowl of cereal over his laptop because he hadn't had time for dinner, and he'd flagged a handful of small lots, surplus fastener kits, a hydraulic fitting set, a partial avionics test board that might or might not be salvageable. The kind of pieces that the wealthy buyers would ignore entirely and that Ethan could clean up and resell to smaller operators for 3 or 4 times what he'd paid. That was the plan. It wasn't a glamorous plan. It wasn't the kind of plan you'd tell anyone about at a party. But it was a plan, and he'd built his small life on plans like this, careful, unglamorous, and just barely functional. The auctioneer was a fast-talking man in his 50s named Dale, who wore a headset microphone and walked the property like he owned it, which, for the duration of the day, he functionally did. He had 2 assistants trailing him with clipboards, and behind the whole operation, parked on the far side of the field in a black SUV with tinted windows, was the car that Ethan had noticed the moment he walked in. Not because of the car, because of who was standing beside it. He hadn't known who she was at first. He'd seen a woman in a dark coat, heels that had no business being in this field, and the particular posture of someone who was here because they decided to be here and could leave at any moment they chose. She was talking on a phone. She didn't look at anyone. He'd found out her name from the man standing next to him in line, a middle-aged parts dealer named Frank, who seemed to know everyone and had opinions about all of them. "That's Victoria Hale," Frank had said, with the tone of someone reporting the weather. "Hale Dynamics. She bought the Mercer portfolio last spring, aerospace acquisitions, mostly vintage." Ethan had looked at her again. "She's here herself?" "Sometimes she does that. Shows up in person for the interesting ones." Frank shrugged. "Mostly I think she likes watching people spend money on things she could buy with what she spent on those shoes." That had been 2 hours ago. Now the auction was moving through its 4th lot of the morning, and Ethan was getting antsy. The fastener kits had gone fast and high. A collective buyer's energy had swept through the crowd and pushed them well above what Ethan could justify. The hydraulic fitting set was still 3 lots away. He moved through the crowd, keeping to the edges, watching. That was when he saw it. It was sitting at the far end of the field, past the main rows of cataloged items, in an area that looked like it had been designated for overflow. A handful of pieces were grouped there with numbered tags, but no detailed descriptions. The estate's miscellaneous category, the things that hadn't fit neatly anywhere else. The canopy was enormous. Not enormous in the way that made it impressive at first. Enormous in the way that makes something seem out of place, too large for its surroundings, like furniture from the wrong room. It was a cockpit canopy, a full enclosure shell, the kind that fits over the entire front section of an aircraft, but it was bigger than anything standard, made from what looked like titanium with a composite frame, and it had taken significant damage somewhere along the way. The forward edge was buckled. There was a stress fracture running along the port side about 18 inches long. The transparency panels, whatever material had been used for the windscreen, were gone entirely, leaving the frame like the skeleton of a mouth. It sat on 2 old wooden pallets, and it was, by every visual measurement, a complete wreck. People were walking past it without slowing down. Ethan stopped. He stood there for a moment just looking. There was something off about the proportions. Not just the size, but the geometry. The curvature of the frame was unusual. Most cockpit enclosures followed predictable arcs, standard engineering curves optimized for aerodynamics and visibility. This one had a different profile. He couldn't immediately explain why it looked wrong to him, but the wrongness was specific. The kind of specific that meant someone had made a deliberate engineering decision that departed from convention. He crouched down. The titanium was thick. Thicker than it needed to be for a conventional aircraft. He stood back up and looked at the damage more carefully. The buckle in the forward edge wasn't random impact damage. It had a directionality to it that suggested the force had come from inside, like something had expanded or pressurized and pushed outward. "Lot 42, Dale called from somewhere behind him. "Miscellaneous aviation hardware, Group C. Who'll start us at 500? Ethan looked at the tag on the pallet. Lot 42-C, listed simply as cockpit enclosure assembly, damaged, non-airworthy, no documentation. 200, someone called, clearly just to get things moving. Ethan took a breath. He wasn't supposed to be buying this. He had no idea what it was. He had $250 that he'd assigned to a specific purpose, and this enormous broken shell was not that purpose. He raised his paper slip. $250. The crowd moved slightly. A few people glanced at him. The guy in the worn jacket who'd been standing at the edge all morning. $250, Dale confirmed. Do I hear 3? A long pause. $250 going once. Dale looked around. The collectors in the crowd had already moved past it. The serious buyers weren't interested in something with no documentation and obvious structural damage. Going twice. Sold to number 47 for $250. The man next to Ethan, not Frank, a different man, older, in a decent coat, looked at him with genuine pity. What are you going to do with that? I don't know yet, Ethan said honestly. Otto. Getting it onto his truck required borrowing a flatbed dolly from one of the estate workers and 25 minutes of awkward maneuvering, after which the canopy was strapped to the bed of his truck in a way that technically met the legal requirements for transport, but would have given any engineer heartburn. He'd had to let 3 inches of the rear end extend past the tailgate, and he'd flagged it with an orange rag from his glove box. He was tying the last strap when he heard footsteps on the gravel behind him. That's going to shift on the highway if you don't add a forward anchor point. He turned around. Victoria Hale was standing about 6 feet away, looking at the load. Up close, she was sharper than she'd seemed from a distance. Not softer, sharper. Dark eyes that took inventory of everything they landed on. She had the phone in her hand but wasn't looking at it. There's a D-ring on the passenger side, Ethan said. I'm going to run a line from there to the leading edge of the frame. She looked at him. You know what you're doing. With straps, yeah. With that. She nodded at the canopy. Not yet. A short silence. She tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they're recalibrating an assumption. You paid $256 for it, counting registration. That's right. It's not worth $256. Maybe. He turned back to the strap. Or maybe you don't know what it's worth. He heard a small sound. Not quite a laugh. Not quite not a laugh. I run an aerospace acquisitions firm. I've handled documented prototypes worth $40 million. That thing is damaged, unidentified scrap metal with no provenance. Then you got a good deal selling it. He pulled the strap tight, checked the tension, pulled it again. Another pause. He could feel her still standing there. He turned back around. "Why did you buy it?" she asked, and this time the question sounded different, like she actually wanted to know. Ethan looked at the canopy on his truck, the buckled edge, the missing transparency panels, the geometry that was slightly wrong in a way he couldn't explain yet. "The proportions are off," he said. "The curvature isn't standard. And whoever built this used more titanium than they needed to, which means they were engineering for something that goes beyond normal stress loads." He paused. "I want to know why." Victoria Hale looked at the canopy, then back at him. Something shifted in her expression. Brief, almost invisible, like a door opening an inch and then closing again. "Well," she said, "good luck with that." She walked back toward the black SUV. Ethan tied the forward anchor line, got in his truck, and drove home. His workshop occupied the ground floor of a building he'd bought cheaply when the neighborhood was still considered marginal and was now considered up-and-coming, which so far had meant his property taxes went up, but his clientele hadn't changed. He did repair work on aerospace components, small operators, charter services, individual aircraft owners who couldn't afford the dealership rates and trusted Ethan because he'd built a reputation for being honest about what he could and couldn't fix. He'd cleared floor space before he left that morning. He slid the canopy off the truck using the dolly and a section of pipe as a roller, a process that took 40 minutes and resulted in one skin knuckle, and got it positioned under the main work light. Then he stood back and looked at it. In the workshop light, it looked different. The damage was the same, but the construction was more apparent. Someone had put serious engineering into this. The composite frame wasn't patched together. It was precision manufactured, the joints machined to tolerances that you didn't see on experimental one-offs. Whoever had built this had had access to real equipment and real material budgets. He got a wire brush and started on the surface corrosion, not because he expected to find anything, just because that was how he worked. Clean it first. See what you actually have. He worked for 2 hours. The titanium came back to its dull silver under the corrosion, and the frame structure became clearer. The stress fracture was survivable, not structural, just cosmetic damage at the surface layer. The buckle in the forward edge was more serious but limited to a small section. It was just after 11 when he found the seam. He almost missed it. It ran along the interior lower edge of the starboard side wall, hidden beneath a layer of old sealant that had hardened and darkened over the years to look like just more structural material. But the wire brush caught the edge of it differently. The sealant flexed slightly instead of staying rigid. And Ethan stopped. He got a flashlight, got down on his knees on the concrete floor. The seam was continuous, about 14 inches long, running parallel to the bottom edge of the frame. It wasn't a crack. It was intentional. Someone had built a compartment into the wall of the frame itself. Ethan sat back on his heels. "Huh," he said, to nobody. He went to his bench and got a thin pry tool and a heat gun. He spent 20 minutes softening the old sealant carefully, working in short passes to avoid damaging the material underneath. The sealant came away in sections, revealing a hairline gap that ran the full length of the seam. He worked the pry tool into the gap at the middle point, applied gentle pressure, and the panel came free. It swung outward on a small internal hinge, a hidden access door, maybe an inch and a half deep, cut into the thickness of the titanium wall. Inside, packed tightly against the inner face, were a series of documents in what appeared to be a sealed polymer sleeve that had kept them protected from moisture. Behind the documents, pressed flat against the back of the compartment, was a thin metal plate, aluminum, about 4 inches by 3, with text engraved into its surface. Ethan lifted everything out and set it on his workbench. He opened the polymer sleeve first carefully, the way you open something you can't unopen. The top sheet was a hand-drawn engineering schematic, not a photocopy, an original, drawn in pencil and ink on drafting paper that had yellowed but held its integrity. The drawing showed an aircraft in profile, and even to Ethan's non-aeronautical eye, it was immediately clear that this wasn't a conventional design. The fuselage was wide and low. The engine configuration was unusual. What looked like a hybrid arrangement he didn't have a name for. And at the front of the aircraft, matching the proportions of the canopy on his workbench with a precision that made his stomach go slightly hollow, was the cockpit enclosure. The same canopy, the same unusual curvature, the same proportions that had been bothering him all day. He turned to the second sheet, then the third. There were 9 sheets of drawings in total, each one detailed, each one clearly the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The drawings were not labeled with a project name, but they were initialed in the lower right corner of each page, a small, careful hand. EMH. Behind the drawings were 6 photographs, black and white, printed on heavy photographic paper. The first 2 showed the aircraft, or what he assumed was the same aircraft, on a runway, nose on and from the side, with no markings visible on the airframe and no identifiable background elements. The aircraft looked like nothing he'd ever seen in any aviation history book or catalog. The third photograph showed a group of people standing in front of what appeared to be a hangar bay. They were in work clothes, not uniforms, a mix of ages. They were not posing formally. It looked candid, the kind of photo someone takes because they want to remember a moment, not because they're documenting something official. Someone had written on the back in ballpoint pen, "Test team, final prep." We made it. The fourth and fifth photographs showed instrument panels and cockpit interior details. The sixth photograph was a portrait. A woman, maybe late 30s, in practical work clothes, standing beside what was clearly a section of the same distinctive frame that was now sitting on Ethan's workshop floor. She was looking directly at the camera with an expression that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite not one. There was a quiet kind of confidence in her face, the kind that comes from knowing something important that most people don't. On the back of the portrait, the same handwriting as before. Eleanor. Ethan put the photograph down and picked up the metal plate. The engraving was small but clear, and it took him a moment to read it in the shop light. Prototype designation, ARIA 7. Aerospace Rescue and Interdiction. Aircraft Experimental. 1 unit first. Flight. Date removed. Designer. EMH. Status. Classification removed. He read it twice. Then he got out his phone and started looking. He spent 3 days looking, which meant 3 days of finding out how little information existed. He searched the designation, ARIA 7, and found nothing usable. The term Aerospace Rescue and Interdiction Aircraft returned some general definitions but no historical programs. He searched the initials EMH, combined with various aerospace history terms, and came up empty in any useful sense. What he found instead were absences. Forums where aerospace historians had discussed gaps in the known record of experimental rescue aircraft from a certain period. References to a classified program that had allegedly been canceled in a way that left no clean paper trail. A mention in one obscure aviation archive post of a prototype that had been completed but never officially logged because the project's funding had been withdrawn suddenly and the principals had moved on to other things without ever being able to make the work public. On the third evening, he called his neighbor, a retired librarian named Margaret, who was 71 and had the most organized mind of anyone he'd ever met, and asked if she could help him think through an archival research problem. She came over with her reading glasses and a notepad and sat at his workbench for 2 hours, looking at the photographs and the drawings, while he made coffee and Cora did homework at the kitchen table in the back, and occasionally came out to look at what they were doing. "What's that?" Cora asked, pointing at the aircraft in the runway photograph. "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Ethan said. "It looks like a frog." "A little bit," he agreed. "Who drew these?" she asked, looking at the schematics. "Someone with the initials EMH." Cora looked at the portrait photograph, the one of the woman standing by the frame. "Is that her?" "Might be." Cora studied the photograph. "She looks like she's proud of something." "Yeah," Ethan said. "She does." Margaret looked up from the schematics. "These aren't amateur drawings. This is professional engineering work, and the design is genuinely novel. The engine configuration on page 4, I don't know enough to evaluate it technically, but I can tell you that whoever drew this was solving a problem methodically, not sketching concepts." She turned the page. "What's interesting to me is what's missing. There's no project title anywhere on these drawings, no institutional header, no funding reference number. Whoever prepared these documents deliberately removed the identifying elements or never included them. Why would you do that? Ethan asked. If you were worried about the work being taken from you, Margaret said simply, or buried. Man. He called an aerospace history consultant on the fourth day, a man named Dr. Paul Renner, who he found through an aviation museum website, who had a reputation for knowing the obscure corners of the mid-century experimental aircraft world. He explained the situation briefly, described the canopy and the documents, and read him the ARIA 7 designation. The line was quiet for a few seconds. Where did you say you found this? Renner asked. Estate auction, Ransom Valley. Another pause. What was the estate? The property belonged to someone named Dax Harmon. He passed about 18 months ago. Dax Harmon. Renner said the name carefully. He was a mid-level logistics contractor, worked the periphery of some classified procurement programs in the 70s and 80s. I interviewed him once, years ago, for a piece I was writing about equipment disposals from canceled programs. He was cagey. A pause. He would have been exactly the kind of person who ended up with something like this. So ARIA 7 is real. It's real, Renner said. I've heard the name twice in 20 years of doing this work, both times as an aside, both times from people who got uncomfortable when I asked follow-up questions. There was a program, short-lived, heavily classified, connected to rescue operations research in the late 70s. I could never pin down exactly what happened to it. The official record is essentially nothing. He paused again. What condition are the documents in? Good. The sleeve kept them protected. And the photographs? Clear, readable. Mr. Cross. Renner's voice had shifted into something that wasn't quite urgency but was close to it. I'd like to see these in person, soon. I'll think about it, Ethan said. He hung up and sat at his workbench for a long moment, looking at the photograph of the woman named Eleanor. 3 days ago, he'd gone to an auction hoping to buy $30 worth of fastener kits. He picked up the portrait photograph and looked at it in the light. Who are you? He thought. On the 5th day, a car pulled up in front of his shop at 9:30 in the morning. It wasn't the black SUV from the auction, but it was close. A different model, same category of vehicle, same kind of professional restraint to it. A man in a suit got out, came to the shop door and knocked, even though it was standing open. Mr. Cross? That's me. My name is James Portman. I'm legal counsel for Hale Dynamics. He held out a card. I'm here to discuss the lot you purchased at the Ransom Valley auction last week. Ethan took the card. Read it. Put it on his bench. Okay, he said. Portman looked at the canopy, which was still under the main work light. The hidden compartment closed and the documents locked in the small fireproof box Ethan kept in his back room. My client is prepared to offer you $8,000 for the item and all associated materials. Ethan picked up his wire brush and went back to what he'd been doing. No. Portman blinked. This was apparently not the response he'd been prepared for. Mr. Cross, I want to be clear. The item has no certifiable provenance. The documentation you found, if any, would belong... I paid $256 for it, Ethan said, without looking up. Everything in or on it was included in that sale. If Ms. Hale's estate cataloged it wrong, that's an internal problem. $8,000 is a significant return on a $256 investment. Yeah, Ethan kept working, but I'm not selling it for $8,000. A pause. May I ask what your price would be? Ethan looked up. I don't have a price right now, because right now what I have is a lot of questions that nobody's answered yet. When I know what this thing actually is, I'll figure out what it's worth. He held Portman's gaze. You can tell Ms. Hale that. Portman picked up his card from the bench, looked at it for a moment, then set it back down. I'll relay your response. He walked out. Ethan watched the car pull away. Then he went to the back room, unlocked the fireproof box, and took out the photograph of Eleanor. He propped it against the wall above his workbench where he could see it while he worked. She was still looking directly at the camera, still wearing that expression that wasn't quite a smile. Okay, he said quietly. Let's figure out who you are. The second offer came 2 days later, $40,000. He said no. He didn't say it rudely. He just said it. Portman had come back in person again, which Ethan took as a signal that someone was paying attention to this in a way that went beyond routine acquisitions cleanup. "I'd like to understand your reasoning," Portman said, with the measured calm of a man who was very good at his job and was starting to find the job difficult. "The documents in that compartment point to an engineering program that someone worked very hard to erase," Ethan said. "The person who designed this aircraft, I don't know her full name yet, but she was real, and she was serious, and whatever happened to the project, the work itself was significant." He looked at Portman. $40,000 doesn't buy the right to bury it again. Portman looked at him for a moment with an expression that was hard to read. Then he nodded, very slightly, and left. That evening, after Cora was asleep, Ethan sat at his kitchen table with Dr. Renner on speaker, going through the schematics page by page. Renner had been sent photographs of every document the day before and had spent 48 hours doing what he described as the most interesting research of his career. "The engine configuration on sheet 4, Renner said. "I showed it to 2 engineers I trust without telling them the source. Both of them said the same thing. It's a hybrid propulsion arrangement that predates anything similar in the public record by roughly 15 years. Meaning? Meaning whoever designed this was not just ahead of their time. They were so far ahead that when the technology finally emerged in the commercial sector, nobody connected it back to this work. Because this work was invisible." A pause. "EMH didn't just design a clever aircraft. She may have originated an engineering approach that shaped everything that came after it, and she never got credit for any of it." Ethan looked at the photograph of Eleanor, propped on his kitchen windowsill now because he'd brought it home to think about it. "Her name was Eleanor," he said. "Yes." Renner's voice was quiet. "I think I know who she was. I'm not ready to say it yet. I need to verify something. But if I'm right..." He stopped. "If I'm right, this is going to be a very big story." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Outside, the street was dark and still. Inside, the apartment was the way it always was at this hour. Small, a little cluttered, Cora's drawings on the refrigerator, his coffee cup from this morning still in the sink because he'd forgotten to wash it. "How big?" he asked. "The kind of big," Renner said slowly, "that makes people who've been very comfortable with the way history reads suddenly very uncomfortable." Ethan looked at the photograph. "Good," he said. He was in the shop the following Thursday, replacing a bearing housing on a turbine component for a charter service operator, when his phone rang with an unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. A minute later it rang again. He answered. "Mr. Cross." A woman's voice. He recognized it immediately. "Miss Hale." A brief pause. "I told James to extend the offer to 40,000. You declined." "I did." "I'd like to understand why." He thought about the portrait photograph, about Renner's voice going careful when he'd said, "I think I know who she was," about the 9 engineering drawings in their polymer sleeve. "You sold me something at auction that you didn't know the value of," he said. "Now you want to buy it back before anyone figures out what it is." "That's a reasonable business instinct," she said. "It's not malicious." "No," he said, "but it's not my problem either." Another pause, this one longer. "What do you want, Mr. Cross?" "Right now, to finish what I started." He picked up the bearing housing. The truth about what this aircraft was, who built it, and why it disappeared. After that, I'll figure out what I want. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had a different quality to it. Less boardroom, something slightly less guarded. "The documents in that compartment," she said. "What do they show?" "Why?" "Because I've been running aerospace acquisitions for 8 years, she said, and for the first time he heard something that sounded like genuine frustration. "And I've never missed something that mattered. I looked at that canopy for 15 seconds and walked away, and I need to know what I missed." Ethan set down the bearing housing. "They show that someone built something extraordinary," he said, and then got erased. The line was quiet for a long moment. "I'll call you next week," she said, and she did. Cora came to the shop on Saturday morning, which she did most Saturdays when she wasn't at her mother's. Ethan and his ex-wife had an arrangement that was functional, if not warm, and Saturdays alternated. When it was his Saturday, Cora sat at the work table in the back corner of the shop with whatever she was drawing or building while Ethan worked, and they talked in the loose, comfortable way of people who had been each other's primary company for long enough to not need sentences to always go anywhere. She had her colored pencils out and was drawing the aircraft from the runway photograph, which he'd printed for her when she asked. "Why does it have that shape?" she asked, pointing at the wide, low fuselage. "I think it was designed to land in places normal aircraft can't," Ethan said. "Shorter runways, rougher terrain. Like a rescue plane?" "Sort of like that, yeah." She colored carefully. "Did they ever use it?" "I don't think it got that far." She looked up. "Why not?" "Someone stopped the project before it was finished." She considered this. "That's sad." "Yeah," he said. "It is." She went back to her drawing. A few minutes passed. "Dad?" "Yeah." "The lady in the photograph." She nodded at the portrait, which was now tacked to the wall above the workbench. "Do you think she knew it was going to get stopped?" Ethan looked at Eleanor's face, the expression that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite not. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I think she knew the work was good, even if nobody else was going to remember it." Cora looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she went back to her drawing. "We'll remember it," she said simply. Ethan watched his daughter draw the wide, unusual aircraft in yellow and blue on the white paper, and something in his chest that had been tight for about 2 weeks loosened slightly. "Yeah," he said. "We will." He turned back to the workbench, to the titanium shell under the light, to the documents in their fireproof box, to the story he was still only beginning to understand. Outside, October moved toward November. The shop smelled like metal and oil and the particular quiet of a place where careful work gets done. On the wall, Eleanor looked out from the photograph with her quiet certainty, still waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Ethan picked up his brush and kept working. Renner called on a Wednesday morning while Ethan was elbow-deep in a compressor housing that had been giving him trouble since Monday. He almost didn't answer. He wiped his hands on a shop rag, looked at the screen, and picked up. "I know who she is," Renner said without preamble. Ethan set the rag down. "Tell me." "Eleanor Margaret Holt." Renner's voice had the quality of someone who had been sitting with information for too long and needed to release it. "Born 1941, died 2003. She had a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from the Caldwell Institute, one of 6 women in her graduating cohort, and by most accounts, she was the strongest of them. She spent most of her career working in applied research, first for a small contractor called Meridian Aerospace Systems, then later as an independent consultant to several classified government programs. A pause. She published exactly 4 papers in her lifetime. 4. For someone with her level of technical capability, that number it's wrong. It's the kind of number you get when someone's work keeps getting absorbed into classified programs where she couldn't put her name on it. And Aria 7? Aria 7 was a rescue and emergency response aircraft program funded through a defense adjacency grant in 1978. The funding was pulled in 1981 under circumstances that the official record describes as budget reallocation, which is bureaucratic language that tells you absolutely nothing. Renner paused. "I found a reference to Eleanor Holt in a decommissioned contractor directory from 1979. She's listed as a technical consultant to a project designated only by a number, and the project number matches the grant series that funded ARIA 7. Ethan was standing very still in the middle of his shop. "So she was the designer." "She was more than the designer," Renner said. "The propulsion configuration in those schematics. I spent 3 days on this, Ethan. 3 days? That configuration is the conceptual precursor to a hybrid drive architecture that became the foundation for 2 commercially significant aircraft programs in the late 90s. Both programs are credited to a team at a firm called Stellarian Dynamics." He let that sit for a moment. Stellarian Dynamics was founded in 1984 by a man named Leonard Sterling. The name landed like a weight on a scale. Ethan had heard of Leonard Sterling the way most people in the aerospace world had heard of him, peripherally, as a kind of fixed star in the industry's sky, present and enormous without requiring much direct attention. Sterling was in his late 70s now, still occasionally visible at industry conferences, his name on buildings and endowments, and the kind of honorary titles that accumulate around men who have spent 50 years at the center of something large. Stellarion Dynamics had built its reputation on innovation, on being ahead of everyone else. "You're telling me," Ethan said slowly, "that the technology Sterling made his name on—" "I'm telling you the timeline is very uncomfortable," Renner said carefully. "I'm not alleging anything. I'm telling you that Eleanor Holt's design work predates Sterling's commercial application of the same fundamental architecture by roughly 15 years, that Holt worked on at least one program in Sterling's orbit during the late 70s, and that those original design documents are sitting in a fireproof box in your workshop." Another pause. "I'm also telling you that Leonard Sterling has been publicly described as one of the foremost innovators in rescue aviation. His foundation funds aerospace history programs. He is, by all appearances, a man deeply invested in the history of this particular field. And if those documents go public, then that history gets a great deal more complicated," Renner said. "Yes." Ethan sat down on the edge of his workbench stool. He looked at Eleanor's photograph on the wall, the expression that wasn't quite a smile. "She never got credit," he said. It wasn't a question. "Not one word, not in any public record I can find." Renner's voice was quieter now. "She died in 2003. Her obituary in the local paper mentioned her doctorate and her years in the aerospace industry and described her as a dedicated professional." 4 sentences. Ethan looked at the 9 engineering drawings in his mind, the careful hand, the precision, the pages and pages of work that represented years of someone's life poured into a problem that mattered. "What do I do with this?" he asked. "That," Renner said, "is entirely up to you." Outside. He thought about it for 2 days. Not obsessively. He had work to get through. He had Cora to pick up from school. He had a truck that was now making 2 sounds instead of 1. But the question sat underneath everything else like a stone under shallow water, always there when he looked down. The practical reality was this. He had documents that might rewrite a significant piece of aviation history. He had a name, Eleanor Holt, and a design and a timeline that raised serious questions about credit and legacy. He had no lawyers, no institutional backing, no media connections, and roughly $300 in his checking account until the charter service paid their invoice at the end of the month. What he had, besides the documents, was the canopy itself. Physical evidence. An original artifact with a sealed compartment that had preserved its contents for decades. On the second evening, he called Victoria Hale. She picked up on the second ring, which surprised him slightly. He'd expected to go through an assistant. "Mr. Cross." "I know what it is," he said. "The canopy. I know the program it came from, and I know who designed it." A silence on her end that was more substantial than the ones before it. "Tell me." Not over the phone. He wasn't sure why he said that. Some instinct, some sense that this conversation needed to happen in a room where both of them could read the other person's face. "In person." Another pause. "My office is in the Aldrin Tower downtown. I can have you—" "My shop," Ethan said. "Here." A brief silence. He expected pushback. He didn't get it. "Tomorrow," she said. 10 o'clock. She came alone, which he hadn't expected. No portman, no assistants, no driver visible in the black SUV that she parked herself on the street in front of the shop. She was dressed like she'd come from, or was going to something important. A dark-fitted jacket, not casual, but she'd made a concession to the industrial neighborhood in the form of flat-soled shoes. He'd put coffee on. He wasn't sure why. He didn't usually make coffee for people who came to the shop. She looked at the canopy first before anything else, walked around it slowly, the way he had at the auction, except with a different kind of attention, the attention of someone doing damage assessment on a mistake. "I had one of my engineers look at the lot photograph after you declined the first offer," she said. "He said the frame geometry was unusual." "Yeah," Ethan said. "That's what I thought too." She looked at him. "I should have had someone look at it before the auction." He could have said something easy here. He didn't. "Probably." She looked back at the canopy. "Where are the documents?" He went to the back room and got the fireproof box. He set it on the workbench and opened it, and laid everything out in order. The polymer sleeve with the schematics and photographs, the metal identification plate, the portrait of Eleanor Last. Victoria looked at each item carefully. She didn't touch them without asking, which he noted. When she got to the schematics, she spent a long time on sheet 4, the engine configuration, with an expression that was controlled but not entirely unreadable. The propulsion layout, she said quietly. Renner had 2 engineers look at it independently. Both said the same thing. It predates any similar public design by 15 years. She looked up. Who's Renner? Aerospace history consultant. He's been helping me identify the provenance. Ethan paused. He identified the designer. Victoria set the schematic down carefully and turned to face him fully. This, Ethan thought, was how she probably looked in boardrooms when something shifted and she was deciding how to respond. Tell me, she said. Eleanor Margaret Holt, aerospace engineer, doctorate from Caldwell Institute, died 2003. She was a consultant on Area 7 in the late 70s. Based on the schematics, she was the primary designer, possibly the only designer on the core architecture. He held Victoria's gaze. The propulsion configuration in those drawings is the conceptual foundation of the hybrid drive architecture that Stellarian Dynamics commercialized in the 90s. He watched her face. He saw the moment it landed. She knew who Stellarian was. Of course she did. Everyone in aerospace acquisitions knew Stellarian, knew Sterling, knew the company's founding mythology. Leonard Sterling, she said. It wasn't a question. The timeline is what it is, Ethan said. I'm not making accusations. But Renner confirmed that Holt worked in Sterling's orbit during the late 70s, and the Area 7 program was canceled in 1981 under vague circumstances, and Stellarian was founded 3 years later. He picked up the portrait photograph of Eleanor and held it out to her. She never got a single public credit. She died with 4 published papers to her name. Victoria looked at the photograph for a long moment. Eleanor's expression, that quiet, unsmiling certainty, seemed to look back at her. What do you want to do with this? Victoria asked. Make it public, Ethan said. All of it. Her name, her work, what she designed, what happened to the program. He paused. I want the story to be told correctly. Victoria set the photograph down gently. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes moving across the workbench. The schematics, the photographs, the identification plate, the canopy in the background under its work light. If this is accurate, she said carefully, it's not just an interesting historical footnote. It complicates Leonard Sterling's entire legacy, his foundation, his endowments, the programs built on his name. She looked at Ethan. He'll fight it. Maybe, Ethan said. Or maybe he's been waiting for it. She frowned slightly. Why would he be waiting for it? Because he's in his late 70s, Ethan said, and he runs aerospace history programs, and he's publicly described as someone deeply invested in the record of this field. He looked at Eleanor's photograph. Sometimes people carry things for a long time, waiting for the right moment to set them down. Victoria studied him for a moment with the particular attention she seemed to give things she hadn't yet categorized. That's a very generous interpretation. It might be wrong, he said, but I'd rather find out than assume the worst and act accordingly. She was quiet again. Then she picked up her coffee. She'd taken a cup when he offered, without ceremony, and looked at the canopy. The offer from James was $40,000, she said. I'd authorize more if the documentation is... I'm not selling it yet, Ethan said. I told you, not until I know the whole story. And if Sterling comes after you legally, claims ownership through some historical contract with Holt or the program, let him try. Ethan turned back to the canopy. I paid $256 at a legitimate public auction for a cataloged lot. Every document in that compartment was part of that lot. I've got the receipt. He heard something that might have been a short exhale, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. I misjudged you at the auction, she said, with a directness that he hadn't fully expected. He looked at her. How so? I thought you were... She paused, choosing words. I thought you were someone who'd found something shiny and didn't understand what he had. You weren't entirely wrong, he said. I didn't understand what I had. No, she said, but you were willing to learn. She looked at him for a moment. Those are different things. He didn't answer that. He wasn't sure what to do with it. Renner drove in from the city the following Saturday, which meant Cora was at her mother's and the shop was quiet. He was a compact, intense man in his early 60s who looked like someone who'd spent decades in libraries and enjoyed it, slightly rumpled, sharp-eyed, carrying a laptop bag that had seen significant use. He shook Ethan's hand with the brief efficiency of someone who wanted to get to the work. He looked at the documents for a long time without speaking, making occasional notes on a legal pad. He looked at the canopy and walked around it and crouched beside it, and ran his hand along the stress fracture with an expression of someone encountering something they'd been reading about in second-hand accounts for years, and were now seeing in the flesh. "Remarkable," he said quietly. And then, because he was not a man given to sentiment, the identification plate is the key. If we can cross-reference the designation sequence against contractor records from the late 70s period, we can establish an unbroken chain connecting this physical artifact to the ARIA-7 program. From there, Eleanor Holt's connection is in the contractor directory I found. Is that enough to go public? It's enough to put the evidence in front of the right people and let them evaluate it. Renner looked up from the plate. What we need is someone who can examine this from the engineering side and confirm that the design work in those schematics is consistent with Holt's known capabilities and methods. Someone with authority in the field. He paused. And someone who was close to the program. You think there are people still alive who worked on it? The test team photograph, Renner said. He picked it up, gently, with the care of a practiced archivist. There are 11 people in this photograph. The handwriting on the back says final prep, meaning this was taken close to first flight. These were real people who showed up on a real morning to watch something they'd built go into the air. He set it down. Some of them might still be alive. Some of them might have been waiting 50 years for someone to ask. Ethan looked at the photograph. 11 people in work clothes in front of a hangar. Someone who'd wanted to remember the moment. How do we find them? Slowly, Renner said, and carefully. We don't want to make noise before we're ready. He looked at Ethan. Are you ready for this to get complicated? It's already complicated. More complicated than this, Renner said, with a seriousness that Ethan took at face value. Yeah, Ethan said. I'm ready. Tit. The third offer from Hale Dynamics came the following week. Not from Portman this time, but from Victoria directly, over the phone. $120,000. Ethan sat with it for a moment. He was at his kitchen table at the end of a long day, and $120,000 was a number that had real weight when you were looking at a checking account with $300 in it and a truck that needed a new something in the drivetrain. No, he said. Ethan. First time she'd used his first name. He noticed. What number gets you to yes? It's not about a number, he said, for what felt like the fourth time to various people. I need you to understand that. It genuinely is not about money right now. Everything is eventually about money, she said. Maybe, he said, but we're not at eventually yet. A silence. Then, I've been doing more research on Eleanor Holt. He straightened slightly. What did you find? She had a son, Victoria said. He's 61, lives about 3 hours from you, in a town called Pemberton. His name is Daniel Holt. A pause. He's a retired machinist. He was apparently never told much about his mother's work. She kept most of it separated from her family life. But he exists, and I think he should probably know what you found. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He hadn't thought about this, about Eleanor having a family, a son who'd grown up and grown old with a mother who'd built something significant and had it vanish. Why are you telling me this? He asked. Because it's the right thing to do, she said, and the plainness of it stopped him for a second. No business framing, no strategic context, just that. I'll contact him, Ethan said. I thought you would. Another pause, shorter this time. The 120,000 stays on the table, no expiration. I'll keep that in mind. I know you will, she said, and something in her voice had changed over the course of these weeks. Less boardroom precision, something that fit the register of the conversation more naturally. He wasn't sure what to do with that either. Well, He called Daniel Holt on a Thursday evening after Cora was in bed. The phone rang 6 times before a man answered with the careful, neutral tone of someone who doesn't recognize the number and has learned to be cautious about who gets his voice. "Mr. Holt? My name is Ethan Cross. I'm a repair technician in Marsfield. I think I found something that belonged to your mother." A long pause. "My mother passed in 2003. "I know. I'm sorry." Ethan kept his voice even. "What I found was part of an aircraft. A prototype she designed in the late 70s. It came to me through an estate auction, and inside it were her original engineering drawings, 9 pages, and a photograph of her." Another pause. This one different, heavier. "What aircraft?" Daniel Holt's voice had changed, still careful, but with something underneath it now. "It was called Area 7, Ethan said, "an aerospace rescue prototype. The design work in those drawings is, according to the people I've had evaluate it, extraordinary. She was ahead of everything else in the field by a significant margin." The silence stretched out long enough that Ethan checked the call was still connected. "She never talked about it," Daniel Holt said finally. His voice was rough now, in a different way. "She worked her whole career and she never talked about what she actually did. I thought she was I assumed it wasn't allowed, classified stuff, and she took that seriously. I never pushed." A pause. "I always thought there was something she wanted to say." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "There was. It just got buried. Can I see the photograph?" "I'll drive it to you," Ethan said, "whenever you want." They agreed on the following weekend. Ethan hung up and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet apartment, and he thought about Eleanor Holt keeping her work locked inside herself for decades, going home to a son who didn't know what she'd built, dying with 4 published papers and a legacy that had been quietly transferred to someone else's name. He thought about Cora asleep in the next room. He thought about what it would mean for her to do something significant and have it disappear. He got up and washed his coffee cup from that morning, the one he kept forgetting to wash. Then he went to bed, and in the morning he went back to the shop, and the canopy sat under its light with its secrets already given up, waiting for someone to decide what to do with them. He drove to Pemberton on a gray Saturday, the portrait photograph in a cardboard sleeve on the passenger seat. Cora was at her mother's, which meant the truck was quieter than usual in the particular way it got quiet without her. Not unpleasant, just noticeable. Daniel Holt lived in a small house at the end of a residential street. He came out to the driveway when Ethan pulled in, a stocky man in his 60s with his mother's direct gaze. Ethan recognized it immediately, and the deliberate movements of someone who'd spent a career doing physical work carefully. They shook hands. Neither of them said anything meaningful in the driveway. They went inside. Ethan put the photograph on the kitchen table and slid it across. Daniel Holt looked at it for a long time without picking it up. His mother, younger than he probably remembered her, standing beside the frame of something she'd built, looking at the camera with that expression that Cora had described as proud. "She looks happy," he said finally. "She looks sure of herself," Ethan said. Daniel nodded. "She was that." He looked up. "What happened to the project?" Ethan told him everything he knew. The funding withdrawal, the buried record, the documents in the sealed compartment, Renner's research, and the timeline that connected Eleanor's design work to what came later. He said it plainly, without editorializing, the way he'd wanted someone to say difficult things to him. Daniel listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, Daniel was quiet for a moment, looking at the photograph. "She knew," he said. "I think she always knew what happened to it. She just couldn't prove it, and she couldn't talk about it, and eventually she—" He stopped, started again. "She just kept working. On other things. For other people." He looked at Ethan. "She never complained about it. That's the part I couldn't understand when I was young. She'd come home tired, and she'd make dinner, and she'd ask me about school, and she never complained." Ethan didn't say anything. "What are you going to do with the documents?" Daniel asked. "Make sure her name is on them," Ethan said. "Publicly. In a way that can't be quietly disappeared again." He looked at Eleanor's photograph. "But I wanted you to know first, before anyone else." Daniel Holt looked at his mother's face for another long moment. Then he looked at Ethan. "Thank you," he said. It was the most direct thing anyone had said to Ethan in the entire course of this, and it landed with a weight that surprised him. He drove back to Marsfield in the gray afternoon with the photograph still in its sleeve on the passenger seat. The truck made its noise. He drove with both hands on the wheel and thought about Eleanor Holt coming home tired and making dinner and asking about school and never complaining, and what it cost a person to carry something like that quietly for a lifetime. He thought about the 9 pages of drawings in the polymer sleeve. The work still there. Still exactly what it had always been. He got back to the shop at 4 in the afternoon, unlocked the door, and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the canopy under its light. He didn't know yet exactly how this ended. He knew who Eleanor was. He knew what she'd built. He knew what had probably been taken from her. And he knew, with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from reasoning, but from somewhere lower and steadier, that he was not going to let it disappear again. He went inside and got back to work. The call came on a Monday morning, 11 days after Ethan's drive to Pemberton. He was under the truck, finally dealing with the drivetrain sound, which had graduated from ignorable to urgent over the weekend, when his phone buzzed on the concrete beside him. He slid out, looked at the screen, and didn't recognize the number. Area code he didn't know. He almost let it go. He answered. "Mr. Cross." The voice was older, measured but not stiff, the kind of measured that comes from decades of speaking carefully in rooms where words had consequences. "My name is Leonard Sterling." Ethan sat up on the concrete. He said nothing for a moment. He was aware of the grease on his hands and the sound of a car passing on the street outside, and the particular quality of silence that falls when something you've been building toward suddenly arrives ahead of schedule. "Mr. Sterling," he said. "I've been made aware of your discovery," Sterling said. "I understand you've been quite thorough in your research. I've had help. Dr. Renner, yes, he's a good historian." A pause. "I'd like to come see it, the canopy and the documents, in person." Ethan got to his feet. He walked to the shop door and stood in the frame, looking at the street. "When?" "Thursday, if that works. I'd bring a small team, 2 engineers and a historian from my foundation, and my personal legal counsel." A brief pause. "I want to be transparent about that. I'm not coming to dispute your ownership or make things difficult. I'm coming because those documents may contain something I've been looking for a very long time." Ethan thought about what Renner had said. Sometimes people carry things for a long time, waiting for the right moment to set them down. "Thursday works," Ethan said. 10 o'clock. He called Renner before the truck was back in the garage. "He reached out to you directly?" Renner said. "This morning." "That's... A pause. "That could mean several things." "I know what it could mean," Ethan said. "I need you here Thursday." "I'll be there." He called Victoria next. She picked up on the first ring this time. "Sterling called me," he said. A silence that lasted exactly 2 seconds. "When?" "This morning. He wants to come Thursday with engineers and his foundation historian." "Ethan." Her voice had that boardroom quality again, the careful one. "You need legal representation before that meeting." "I can't afford legal representation on a Thursday timeline." "I can arrange—" "Victoria." He said it evenly. "I don't want Hale Dynamics lawyers in the room." Another silence. "Then let me come. Not as a buyer, not with Portman. Just me." A pause. "I was the one who sold you that canopy. I have a stake in how this resolves." He thought about it. He thought about her telling him about Daniel Holt, because it's the right thing to do, and the plainness of it. "Fine," he said. "Thursday, 10 o'clock. Assonce." Wednesday evening, he told Cora about it. She was eating cereal at the kitchen table. Dinner had been theoretical that night, both of them picking at leftovers and then abandoning the idea. And he sat across from her and said that some important people were coming to the shop tomorrow to look at the aircraft canopy and the documents. "Like famous people?" she asked. "One of them is pretty well known in the aerospace world," he said. She thought about this. "Is it going to be okay?" He looked at his daughter. She was 7, and she asked that question the way children ask questions they've learned from experience to take seriously. Not dramatically, just directly. "I think so," he said. I don't know exactly how it's going to go, but I think it's going to be okay. She ate her cereal. Then, will Eleanor's name get put on things? That's the goal. She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her cereal. He wished he had her ability to decide something was okay and move on. He sat at the table after she went to bed and looked at the photograph of Eleanor on the kitchen windowsill and tried to think through every way Thursday could go wrong. He came up with quite a few. He went to bed without resolving any of them and slept badly, which was about what he expected. They arrived at 10, and they arrived together, which meant Leonard Sterling and his team had come in 2 vehicles, and Renner and Victoria had driven separately, and they'd all somehow converged in front of the shop at approximately the same moment, which created a brief, awkward minute in the street where everyone acknowledged everyone else with the politeness of people who knew too much about each other and hadn't yet decided how to behave. Leonard Sterling was tall and had the spare, deliberate physicality of a man in his late 70s who had maintained himself carefully, not out of vanity, but out of the understanding that the body was a tool that needed upkeep. He had white hair and deep-set eyes, and he walked with a slight forward lean, the posture of someone always moving toward the next thing. He wore a plain jacket and no tie, which surprised Ethan slightly. He came directly to Ethan and shook his hand. "Thank you for agreeing to this," he said. His grip was firm and brief. "Thank you for calling first," Ethan said. Something moved in Sterling's expression. Quick, nearly invisible. "I almost didn't." They went inside. Ethan had arranged everything on the workbench, the polymer sleeve with the schematics, the photographs in order, the identification plate, and Eleanor's portrait at the end. The canopy was where it always was, under the work light, the hidden compartment door standing open now the way it had been since the night he'd found it. Sterling's 2 engineers went to the canopy immediately, the way engineers always went to the physical object first. They were both in their 50s, both carrying the focused attention of people who'd been briefed thoroughly and were now doing their own evaluation. They didn't speak much, but Ethan caught the look they exchanged when they crouched beside the stress fracture. Not the look of people finding what they expected, but the look of people who'd hoped for something and were finding it. Sterling stood at the workbench and looked at the documents. He didn't touch them. His foundation historian, a woman named Dr. Adler, precise and gray-haired, who'd introduced herself with the efficiency of someone who spent most of her time in archives, carefully examined each page with gloved hands she'd brought herself. Renner stood beside Ethan near the back wall, watching everything, taking notes. Victoria stood near the door, not in the way of someone who'd been relegated to the periphery, but in the way of someone who'd chosen a position that let her see everything at once. Ethan noticed. Nobody spoke for several minutes. The shop was quiet except for the engineers murmuring to each other beside the canopy and the soft sound of Doctor Adler turning pages. Then Sterling picked up Eleanor's portrait photograph. He held it for a long time. His face didn't collapse or dramatically change. But something happened in it, a settling, the way a structure settles when a tension that's been holding it in one position is slowly released. He looked at the photograph with the expression of someone looking at something they had not allowed themselves to look at directly for a very long time. "You know who she was," Ethan said quietly. It wasn't accusatory. It was just a statement of what he was seeing. "Yes," Sterling said. He set the photograph down gently, with the particular care of putting something fragile in a place where it won't fall. "She was my mother." The shop went completely still. Ethan heard one of the engineers stop moving. He heard Renner's pen stop scratching. He heard Victoria shift her weight near the door. He looked at Sterling. He looked at the photograph of Eleanor on the workbench. He looked back at Sterling's profile, the line of his jaw, the set of his eyes, and he saw it. Not dramatically, not like something he should have seen immediately, but with the gradual clarity of a picture coming into focus. "Eleanor Margaret Holt," Ethan said. "She kept her maiden name professionally," Sterling said. "She married my father in 1963. I took his name. She didn't, not for work." He paused. She was very specific about that. The silence in the shop had a different quality now. Not the silence of waiting, but the silence of a room where something has been said that changes the shape of everything in it. "I was 17 when Area 7 was canceled," Sterling said. He was still looking at the workbench, at the photograph. His voice was steady, not performatively steady, but the actual steadiness of someone who has thought through difficult things so many times they've worn smooth. I knew what she'd built. I'd spent summers in that workshop since I was 12 years old. I understood what she'd accomplished. And then it was gone. The funding, the program, the prototype, everything. She was told the project never formally existed in a way that could be publicly acknowledged. He paused. She was a woman in aerospace in 1981. The people who made that decision understood what they were doing. Renner spoke carefully from the back wall. Mr. Sterling, the propulsion architecture in those drawings, I know what it is, Sterling said. He turned to face the room fully for the first time. When I started Stellarian, I built on her work. I had access to her notes, her methodology, her thinking. She shared everything with me. But the classified status of Area 7 meant I couldn't attribute the foundation to her without potentially exposing the program's existence. I was told, by lawyers, by government contacts, that attribution would create legal complications I couldn't manage. His jaw tightened slightly. So I built Stellarian on her shoulders and put my name on the door and told myself that her contribution would eventually be recognized some other way. He stopped. It wasn't. The silence again. You've been waiting for this, Ethan said. Sterling looked at him directly. For 40 years, I've been funding aerospace history programs and endowing scholarships and trying to build something that would eventually allow her work to be acknowledged without me having to explain why I hadn't done it sooner. He paused. That was cowardice dressed up as strategy. I know that. Ethan looked at him for a moment. This tall old man with his mother's eyes and 40 years of a thing he hadn't been able to say. He wasn't sure what he felt. Not sympathy exactly, not anger exactly. Something that was neither but contained both. The documents are genuine, Dr. Adler said from the workbench without looking up. The drafting paper, the ink oxidation, the polymer seal on the sleeve, consistent with late 70s fabrication and storage. And the engineering work is... She paused. The engineering work is extraordinary. I know, Sterling said. He said it with the quiet simplicity of someone who had known for 50 years. One of the engineers came over from the canopy. He was a square-built man named Hauser, who had the direct, no-ceremony manner of someone who spent most of his life around machines. The frame construction, Hauser said to Sterling. The tolerances on the joints. We've been talking about this on the drive up. We've seen this approach before. It's in the secondary airframe methodology on the Stellarian Series 4. He paused. Exactly. Yes, Sterling said. So the Series 4 attribution goes to Eleanor Holt, Sterling said, along with the core architecture of everything that came from it. He said it clearly, without visible hesitation, and Ethan had the sense that he'd been rehearsing this sentence for a very long time and was relieved to finally say it to people who could do something about it. Victoria spoke from near the door. Mr. Sterling. Her voice was careful, professional, but not cold. What you're describing would substantially rewrite the historical record of Stellarian dynamics. I know what it would do, Sterling said. He looked at her, then at Ethan. That's why I'm here. Not to dispute the documents or buy them quietly and make them disappear. I've had that option for years. I could have acquired the Harmon estate directly when Dax Harmon died. I knew what he had. He paused. I didn't. And then it went to auction, and I thought perhaps... He stopped. I thought perhaps this was the moment that the decision got made for me. You let it go to auction deliberately, Ethan said. Sterling met his eyes. I wasn't ready to be the one who forced it. I thought if someone else found it... He paused. Yes. I let it go to auction. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. He thought about Eleanor keeping her work locked inside herself. He thought about Daniel Holt saying she never complained. He thought about a 17-year-old boy who understood what his mother had built and then watched it disappear. There's a test team photograph, Ethan said. He picked it up from the workbench and held it out to Sterling. 11 people. Someone wrote on the back, test team, final prep. We made it. Sterling took the photograph. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned it over and read the handwriting on the back. That's her handwriting, he said. Very quietly. Do you know any of the people in it? Sterling looked at the photograph more carefully. His expression shifted, older memories moving closer. The man on the left, near the hangar door, that's Sal Ferretti. He was the primary structural engineer. He was from somewhere in the Northeast. I think he retired to Vermont. He moved his finger slightly. The woman beside my mother, that's Ruth Cannon. She was a propulsion systems specialist, one of the best in the room. He looked up at Ethan. I don't know if either of them is still alive. We'll find out, Renner said from the back wall. He was already writing. Sterling set the photograph down. He looked at the canopy for a long moment, and then he looked at Ethan. I want to make this right, he said. I have the resources to do it properly. The documentation, the historical attribution, the public record, everything corrected. A permanent installation honoring her work and the entire team. He paused. I'd want to discuss terms with you. The canopy, the documents. Your ownership is legitimate, and I'm not asking you to simply hand them over. I'm asking what it would take for you to let this be done correctly. Ethan looked at the workbench, at the 9 pages of schematics, at Eleanor's portrait. He looked at Sterling. I'm not selling you the right to control how the story gets told, he said. That's the first thing. Whatever happens with this, it happens publicly and completely. Every name on that test team, every engineer who contributed, not a quiet institutional acknowledgement buried in a foundation footnote. The actual story, the actual history, available to anyone who wants to know it. Sterling nodded. Agreed. Second, Ethan said, Daniel Holt needs to be part of this. Her son. He's been living his whole life not knowing what she built. He gets to know, and he gets to be present for however this goes public. Of course, Sterling said, and something in his face shifted when he said it. Relief, Ethan thought, or something close to it. The relief of a debt finally being acknowledged. Third, Ethan said. He paused, because the third condition was the one he'd been thinking about since the night he'd sat at his kitchen table and thought about Cora asleep in the next room. The engineers on that team, they didn't get credit either. Not just your mother, all of them. Sal Ferretti and Ruth Cannon, and whoever else we can find or document. Their names go on whatever this becomes. Sterling looked at him steadily. Yes. And a fund, Ethan said. For young people from working-class families who want to work in engineering and can't afford the pathway in. Named for the team, not just for Eleanor, for all of them. The room was quiet. Then Sterling said, I was going to propose that myself. Ethan looked at him. Then we're aligned. Sterling extended his hand. Ethan shook it. It wasn't clean. It wasn't the end of complexity. There were lawyers and documents and 1,000 decisions still ahead, and Sterling had 40 years of complicated history that an afternoon conversation couldn't fully resolve. Ethan knew that. He wasn't naive about it. But the hand was offered, and he took it, because refusing it would have been about pride rather than principle, and Eleanor Holt's work deserved better than being the instrument of someone's pride. Hauser, the square-built engineer, came to Ethan while Sterling was speaking quietly with Dr. Adler at the workbench. The canopy is in better shape than it looks, Hauser said, the way engineers deliver information. Plainly, without embellishment. The stress fracture is surface level. The buckle is repairable. If someone wanted to restore it, it should be restored, Ethan said. Hauser looked at him, then at the canopy. I can give you a structural assessment, properly, not just eyeballing it. He paused. I'd like to, if that's acceptable. Yeah, Ethan said. That's acceptable. Hauser nodded and went back to the canopy, and Ethan watched him crouch beside the frame with the careful attention of someone who had just been given permission to care about something. Victoria came to stand beside him. They stood there for a moment, both of them looking at the room. Sterling and his team and Renner all gathered around the workbench, and the canopy and the photograph of Eleanor, this small industrial space that had somehow become the room where a 50-year silence was finally being addressed. You handled that well, Victoria said quietly. I just said what I thought, he said. Most people don't. He looked at her briefly. You told me about Daniel Holt. That was... She paused. That felt necessary. It was, he said. It mattered. She was quiet for a moment. I've been in acquisitions for 8 years. I've bought and sold pieces of aerospace history, and I've been good at it, and I've always thought of it as work I was genuinely suited for." She paused. "I looked at that canopy at the auction for 15 seconds and decided it was worthless scrap. And the reason I decided that is because I was looking at what it appeared to be instead of asking what it might contain." "You do that with everything?" Ethan asked. Not harshly, genuinely. She considered it. "I do it enough that I should probably think harder about it." He nodded. He wasn't sure what else to say to that. "The $50 million figure my team modeled," she said, shifting register back to something more practical. But not as a deflection, Ethan thought, more as a way of grounding herself. "Based on the historical significance, the physical artifact, and the rights associated with the documentation, Sterling will offer something close to that." "Probably. What are you going to do with it?" Ethan looked at the canopy, at the workshop around it, the worn concrete floor, the clip-on LEDs he'd been slowly replacing, the bench his father had built and given him when he opened the place 4 years ago. "Expand this," he said. "Get some apprentices in, maybe put a proper teaching space in the back." He paused. "And pay off the truck." She almost smiled. Not quite. It was the almost smile he'd been cataloging since the auction, the one that arrived at the edge of her face and stopped just short. "The truck." "It's been making a noise," he said. "I know," she said. "You mentioned it." "I mention it a lot," he said. "It bothers me." She did smile then, briefly, imperfectly, in the way of someone who doesn't smile easily and therefore means it when they do. It looked better than a polished smile would have. He looked away before it became something he had to address. Across the shop, Sterling had picked up Eleanor's portrait photograph again. He was holding it the way he'd held it the first time. Carefully, with the particular attention of someone looking at something that costs them something to look at. Ethan watched him. The old man in the photograph of his mother, standing in a shop full of people who were finally, after 50 years, in the same room with the truth about what she'd built. He thought about Cora drawing the aircraft at the work table on a Saturday. "We'll remember it," said with the matter-of-fact certainty of a 7-year-old who'd decided something and saw no reason to complicate it further. He thought she was right. Yeah, Renner found 2 members of the original test team within 3 weeks. Sal Ferretti was alive, 81 years old, living in a town in Vermont exactly as Sterling had guessed. And when Renner reached him by phone and explained what had been found, Ferretti was quiet for a long time, and then said, "I've been waiting for someone to call for 40 years," in a voice that Renner later described as the most exhausted kind of relief he'd ever heard. Ruth Cannon had passed in 2018, but her daughter was alive and had boxes of her mother's personal papers, and among those papers, when they were finally opened and examined, were handwritten notes from the ARIA-7 project that corroborated every detail in Eleanor's schematics and added another dimension to the record that nobody had known existed. There were 4 other team members they could trace, 2 living, 2 gone. The families of those who were gone were located and contacted, and every one of them had the same response in different words. She mentioned a project she couldn't talk about. He said it was the best work he ever did. We always wondered. The story was coming together piece by piece across the distance of decades. It was messy and incomplete, and it had gaps that would never fully close. It was the kind of story that the real ones almost always are. In Ethan's shop, the canopy sat under its work light, doors open, its secrets fully given up. Hauser had filed his structural assessment, 6 pages, detailed, concluding with the word restorable in the summary, and Sterling's team was working on a plan for the restoration and permanent installation. On the wall above the workbench, Eleanor's photograph was still tacked where Ethan had put it. She was still looking directly at the camera, still wearing that expression. He'd stopped trying to decode it weeks ago. He'd decided it didn't need decoding. It was just the face of someone who'd done the work and knew the work was good, and was looking at whoever happened to be standing there with the simple expectation that eventually, if the work was good enough, someone would find it. Someone had found it. He picked up his brush and got back to work. The lawyers arrived on a Thursday, 6 weeks after the meeting in Ethan's shop. Not just Sterling's legal team this time, there were 4 of them now, representing different interests, and they spent 3 hours in a conference room at a downtown hotel, working through the language of an agreement that was, as one of them put it with the careful understatement of a man billing by the hour, somewhat unprecedented in scope. Ethan sat on his side of the table with a contract attorney named Sylvia Marsh, who Renner had recommended and who charged reasonable rates and had the practical, no-nonsense manner of someone who had seen enough complicated deals to not be impressed by the complexity of this one. Sylvia had read all the documentation over the previous week. She'd asked Ethan exactly 4 questions, all of them sharp and specific, and then she'd said, "You're in a strong position. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." He was trying to keep that in mind. Sterling's lead counsel, a man named Arthur Breen, who had the silver-haired authority of someone who had been the most important person in every room he'd entered for 30 years, spent the first 40 minutes outlining Stellarian's position on the historical record, which was essentially a controlled and pre-lawyered version of everything Sterling had said in the shop. Acknowledgement of Eleanor Holt's foundational contribution, willingness to correct the attribution across all relevant historical documentation, commitment to the public record. Then Breen put a number on the table, $52 million. For the canopy, the original documents, the identification plate, and a licensing agreement covering the historical rights to the Area 7 story for purposes of preservation and public exhibition. Ethan looked at the number on the paper. He looked at Sylvia. Sylvia looked at the number with the expression of someone who had expected a number in this range and was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of reacting to it. "We have 3 conditions," Ethan said. He'd written them on a notepad that morning at the kitchen table. He didn't look at the notepad. He knew them. First, the public disclosure of Eleanor Holt's role as the primary designer of Area 7 and the foundational architect of the propulsion methodology that became the basis of Stellarian's Series 4 development. This disclosure must be unambiguous, substantive, and permanent. Not a foundation footnote, not an internal acknowledgement. Public, documented, irrevocable. Breen nodded slowly. "We're prepared to—" "I'm not finished," Ethan said. Breen stopped. "Second, every member of the ARIA 7 test team receives credit by name in all future public records associated with this discovery. The living members and the families of those who have passed. Individual recognition, not collective acknowledgement. Each person's specific contribution documented to the extent the record allows." He paused. "Sal Ferretti is 81 years old. He's been waiting 40 years for someone to put his name on the work he did. I'd like that to happen while he's still around to see it." The room was quiet. Breen looked at Sterling, who was seated to his left. Sterling gave a small nod. "Third," Ethan said, "a scholarship fund. Minimum endowment of $5 million structured for long-term sustainability. For young people from working class and lower-income families pursuing engineering and aerospace disciplines. Named for the Area 7 team, not for Eleanor alone, not for the Holt family, not for Stellarian. For the team." Breen's pen had stopped moving. "That's the framework," Ethan said, "but the numbers are negotiable, the conditions aren't." A silence settled over the conference room table that had the particular texture of people recalibrating. Breen looked at his papers. One of the other lawyers made a note. Victoria, who was seated on Ethan's side of the table, not as his representative, but as a party with her own stake in the resolution of the Ransom Valley auction, watched Breen with the calm attention of someone who had been in rooms like this many times and knew exactly what was happening. It was Sterling who spoke. "The conditions are accepted," he said. Quietly, directly, without consulting Breen. "All 3. Breen looked at his client with the brief, controlled expression of a lawyer whose client had just made his morning considerably more complicated. "Leonard," Breen started. "Arthur." Sterling's voice was mild but final. "These are reasonable conditions. They're also correct." He looked at Ethan across the table. "The endowment will be $10 million, not 5. Ethan looked at him. 5 was the minimum." "I know." Sterling held his gaze. 10 is what it should be." Ethan looked at Sylvia. Sylvia looked at the table and said nothing, which was her way of saying, "I'm not going to tell you what to do here." "Okay," Ethan said. 10. The paperwork took another 2 weeks. Sylvia earned her fee 3 times over in that period, catching language in 3 different clauses that would have gradually eroded the public disclosure condition into something more manageable for Stellarian's public relations team. Each time she flagged it, Breen's team revised it, and by the end the document said what it needed to say in terms that Sylvia described as legally airtight, which is as good as it gets. Ethan signed on a Wednesday afternoon in Sylvia's office, which was a modest space in a building 20 minutes from his shop. He used her pen, which was a cheap ballpoint, not the kind of pen people brought out for significant occasions. He signed his name 6 times in 6 different places, and then sat back in the chair. "That's it?" he asked. "That's it," Sylvia said. He said. She looked at him. "What?" "Nothing. I just thought it would feel different." She gathered the documents with the brisk efficiency of someone who had to be somewhere. "It'll feel different when the check clears." The check cleared 4 days later. Ethan was in the shop when his phone showed the notification from his bank, a number with more digits than he was accustomed to seeing in that column. And he stood there for a moment holding the phone and looking at it. Then he went back to the compressor housing he was rebuilding for a client, because he had a deadline and the compressor wasn't going to fix itself on account of him having money now. He told Cora that evening. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, which was where they had all the important conversations, and he told her that the aircraft and the documents had been sold and that they were going to be okay for a long time. She looked at him carefully. "How okay?" "Very okay," he said. She thought about this with the seriousness she brought to consequential information. "Does that mean you can fix the truck?" "Yes," he said. "The truck is getting fixed." "Good," she said, with sincere relief. "It's embarrassing." "I know," he said. "I know it is." She went back to her drawing, and he sat at the table and watched her for a moment. Her head bent over the paper, her careful hand moving, and he felt something that didn't have a clean name, the particular fullness of a moment that you know you'll remember. He didn't try to hold on to it. He just let it be there. The press announcement came on a Friday, 4 weeks after the signing. Sterling's communications team had prepared a formal release, but Sterling had asked Ethan if there was anything he wanted included, and Ethan had said yes, Daniel Holt's name, alongside Eleanor's, at the front of the story. Not as an addendum, at the front. Daniel had driven in the night before and stayed in Ethan's spare room, which was also Cora's art room, and they'd moved the art supplies to the kitchen table and set up the folding cot that Ethan kept in the closet. Daniel had sat at the kitchen table until late, reading through Dr. Adler's full historical report on ARIA 7, which Sterling's Foundation had been compiling for 3 weeks. He read it slowly, the way someone reads something they are both eager to get through and not ready to finish. At one point, Ethan had come out for a glass of water and found Daniel sitting with the report closed on the table in front of him, looking at Eleanor's portrait photograph, which was still on the windowsill. "She would have hated the fuss," Daniel said. "Maybe," Ethan said. "She liked the work. She didn't care much about the recognition." He paused. Or she told herself she didn't. He looked at the photograph. "I think she cared. I think she just got so tired of caring about something she couldn't have that she stopped letting herself." Ethan got his water. He sat down at the table. "She kept the documents," he said. "She sealed them and hid them in the frame of the aircraft before it went to storage. She knew the canopy might end up somewhere eventually." He paused. "That's not someone who stopped caring." Daniel looked at the photograph for another moment. "No," he said. "I suppose it isn't." They sat in the kitchen for a while without talking, which was the kind of quiet that doesn't require filling. The press announcement went out at 9 in the morning, and by noon, it was moving through aerospace news outlets, and by 3 in the afternoon, it had reached general news. Ethan spent most of the day in his shop with his phone on silent, which was the only way he knew to manage the volume of messages arriving from people he'd never heard of who had opinions about the story. Renner called at 4. "It's everywhere," he said, with the satisfaction of a historian watching a fact finally find its proper place in the record. "The engineering journals are already picking it up. Dr. Adler's full report is going to be published in the Foundation's quarterly next month." A pause. "Sal Ferretti called me this morning. He'd already seen the announcement." "What did he say?" Renner was quiet for a moment. He said he was glad someone found the damn canopy. Those were his exact words. Ethan smiled. That's a good quote. It really is. Quote. Victoria came to the shop that evening after the media cycle had done its first rotation and the phone had stopped buzzing every 4 minutes. She came alone, the way she'd been coming lately, and she parked on the street and knocked on the open door the way she always did now, even though it was standing open. The announcement is doing well, she said. I've been ignoring it mostly. Smart. She looked around the shop. It looked the same as it always had. The worn floor, the work light, the bench. The canopy was still there, waiting for Hauser's restoration team to arrange transport. How are you? Fine, he said, then reconsidered. Tired, a little strange. She looked at him. Strange how? I spent 10 weeks on this thing that was completely consuming, and now it's done, and the documents are signed, and the story is out there. He paused. And I don't know what to do with my hands. You're fixing a compressor housing, she said, nodding at the bench. That's true, he said. The compressor housing is helping. She came to stand beside the canopy. She did that sometimes when she came, but just stood near it, looking at it. He'd stopped finding it odd. He thought maybe she was working something out. I owe you an apology, she said. You've said that. I said I misjudged you. That's not the same as an apology. She looked at the canopy. At the auction, I saw a man with a paper slip and a worn jacket bidding on a piece of junk that nobody wanted, and I made a decision about who he was in about 4 seconds. She paused. I do that. I've been good at it for long enough that I stopped questioning whether being fast was the same as being right. Ethan leaned against the bench. What changed? You did what you said you were going to do. She turned to look at him. Every time I offered money, you said the money wasn't the point. And I kept waiting for the moment when you'd show me what the point actually was. Some hidden agenda, some angle. Because in my experience, people who say money isn't the point are usually the people most focused on the money. She paused. But you meant it. You actually meant it. I just wanted to know whose work it was, Ethan said, and then I wanted her name on it. I know. Victoria looked at him steadily. That's what I'm apologizing for not being able to see that as straightforwardly as it was. He looked at her for a moment. In the shop light, she looked different than she had at the auction. Less polished, or maybe just less armored. He'd noticed the armor going down gradually over the weeks, the way ice thaws. So slowly you don't notice each degree, but eventually you look up and the river is moving. Accepted, he said. She nodded. She almost smiled. The almost smile, the real one. The one that stopped just short. He'd gotten used to it. He'd gotten used to a lot of things about her that he hadn't planned on getting used to. Hale Dynamics is going to be one of the Foundation's institutional partners, she said, shifting back to practical ground, the way she did when something got close to the edge of what she was comfortable with. For the scholarship fund, we're contributing $2 million to the endowment. That's generous. It's the least I can do. She said it plainly, without the kind of self-deprecation people use to invite argument. It is genuinely the least I can do, given that I sold the thing that started all of this for $256 and then tried 4 times to buy it back. You were doing your job, Ethan said. I was doing it badly. He didn't argue with that. How's your engineer, the one who told you the geometry was unusual after the first offer? She looked briefly caught. He got a raise. Ethan raised an eyebrow. After you'd already declined the lot at the auction? He looked at the photograph on his own time. He brought it to me. She paused. He should have been there before the auction. That's my failure, not his. He studied her for a moment, the way she took responsibility for things, directly, without drama, which was one of the things he'd noticed about her that didn't fit the profile he'd built of her in the first few minutes at the auction. She wasn't who he'd thought she was. He suspected she was still working out who she actually was, which was a thing he understood. What do you want to do next? She asked. Expand the shop, he said. Take on a couple of apprentices. Build out a proper training space in the back. He looked around. I've been thinking about it for a while. This place could be something more useful than it currently is. That's a good use of the money. I think so. He paused. What about you? She seemed slightly surprised by the question, as if she'd been so accustomed to being the one asking that being asked required a moment of adjustment. I've been thinking about what you said, about looking at what something appears to be instead of asking what it might contain. She looked at the canopy. I've been doing this work for 8 years and I've been good at it, but I think I've been good at a version of it that's, she paused, narrower than it needs to be, than it should be. What would the wider version look like? She was quiet for a moment. I'm not entirely sure yet. I'm working on it. Okay, he said. She looked at him briefly. That doesn't bother you, that I don't have an answer? No, he said. I think working on it is the honest place to be. She held his gaze for a moment longer than she needed to, and then she looked away, back at the canopy, and the shop was quiet. Yeah. The formal ceremony for the public unveiling of the historical discovery was held 3 weeks later in the atrium of the Stellarian Foundation's main building downtown, a space that had been cleared and set with chairs for about 200 people, including journalists, aerospace historians, Foundation members, and the families of the ARIA-7 team. Sal Ferretti came from Vermont. He arrived with a cane and his daughter, and he was the first person Ethan saw when he walked in. The old man was 81 and moved slowly but looked at the room with the alert, assessing eyes of someone who had spent a career solving problems that required him to see clearly. Ethan crossed the room. Mr. Ferretti, he said, and held out his hand. Ferretti looked at him for a moment. You're the one who found it. Yes, sir. Ferretti shook his hand with a grip that was still firm. We hid that compartment ourselves, Eleanor and I and Ruth Cannon. We spent a Sunday afternoon in the hangar sealing those documents in and hoped like hell someone would eventually open it. Ethan stared at him. You knew someone would find it? We hoped, Ferretti said. Eleanor she was very specific about it. She said the work was too important to disappear completely. She said if we buried it well enough, it would survive long enough for someone to care about it. He paused. She was right. Did you know what happened to the canopy after the program was canceled? It went into a government surplus disposal chain. We lost track of it. Ferretti looked across the room toward the front, where a large photograph of Eleanor had been placed on a display stand, the portrait from the workshop, enlarged and mounted properly. I spent about 10 years trying to find it through official channels and got nowhere. Eventually I stopped. He looked at Ethan. Then you called. Ethan looked at the photograph of Eleanor. From across the room she was the same. That expression, that direct look, that quiet certainty. She knew someone would find it, he said. She believed in the work, Ferretti said simply. She always believed if the work was good enough, eventually it would find its way. Daniel Holt arrived 20 minutes before the ceremony began, and Ethan met him at the door. They shook hands in the way they'd developed over the past few weeks, brief, solid, without excess. Daniel looked at the room with the particular expression of someone confronting a thing they had imagined many times and are now finding real, which is never quite what imagination prepared them for. That's her, Daniel said quietly, looking at the enlarged photograph. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. She looks the way she did when she was thinking about a problem she was interested in. Ethan looked at the photograph. What does that look like? Like she already knows what she thinks, Daniel said, and she's waiting to see if the evidence agrees with her. He paused. She was usually right. Sterling found Ethan 20 minutes into the reception that followed the ceremony. He moved through the room with the measured pace of a man who had spent decades at events like this and no longer needed them for his ego, only for the work. The Foundation's board approved the scholarship structure this morning, he said. The first cohort will be selected in the spring. 20 recipients, 10 million endowment, conservatively managed, should run the program for decades. Good, Ethan said. Sterling looked at him steadily. You could have taken the money and walked away after the signing. Most people would have. Most people probably needed the money more than I needed the conditions, Ethan said. That's not why you did it. No, Ethan said. It's not. Sterling was quiet for a moment. She would have liked you, he said. My mother. She had no patience for people who cared about the appearance of things. But she respected people who cared about the thing itself. He paused. You cared about the thing itself. Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. Sometimes the right response to something is just to let it land. He looked at the enlarged photograph across the room. Eleanor in her work clothes, standing beside the frame of the Area 7 prototype, looking at the camera with that expression. She'd sealed those documents herself. She and Ferretti and Ruth Cannon on a Sunday afternoon in a hangar, hoping like hell someone would eventually open it. 50 years. Sealed in titanium in a hidden compartment, in a canopy that had traveled through government surplus and estate sales and a field auction in October, until a man with a paper slip and a worn jacket and $400 in his checking account had stopped in front of it and thought, the proportions are off. Across the atrium, Victoria was speaking with Dr. Adler and one of the Aerospace Journal editors, and she turned at some point and found Ethan across the room, and they exchanged the brief look of two people who had been through something together and were both, in different ways, still working out what it meant. He looked away first, not because he wanted to, but because the room required his attention, and he'd gotten into the habit, over the past 10 weeks, of doing the thing that needed doing instead of the thing he'd prefer to do. He went to find Sal Ferretti and introduce him to Daniel Holt, because those two men had never met, and both of them deserved to. He found them already talking. Of course they were. They'd been circling the same absence for 50 years. When people who have been shaped by the same missing thing finally end up in the same room, they find each other. That's just how it works. He watched them from a few feet away. The old engineer with his cane and the machinist's son who'd grown up not knowing, both of them looking at the photograph of Eleanor on the display stand. Both of them with expressions that were complicated in ways that a single word couldn't cover. He didn't interrupt. Some things you just witness. Some things don't need you to do anything except be present for them and understand that you played a part in making them possible, which is enough, which is more than enough, which is, when you set down all the noise around it, exactly what the work was for. The restoration took 8 months. Hauser's team worked out of a climate-controlled facility that Stellarian leased specifically for the project, and they approached the canopy with the deliberate care of people who understood they were handling something that existed in 2 registers at once, as a physical artifact that needed structural repair, and as an object that had already accumulated a weight of meaning that no amount of engineering skill could touch. They kept Ethan informed through bi-weekly reports that he read at his kitchen table in the evenings, after Cora was asleep, with the same attention he'd given to everything else in this long, strange year. He visited the facility twice. The first time was in January, 3 months into the work, when Hauser had invited him to see the progress. The buckle in the forward edge had been carefully reformed. The stress fracture was sealed. The composite frame had been cleaned back to its original surface and treated. The canopy was starting to look less like wreckage and more like what it had always actually been. A piece of precision engineering that had been waiting, under the damage, for someone to look past the surface and find it. Ethan stood beside it for a long time without saying anything. Hauser stood nearby, not filling the silence, which Ethan appreciated. "She's going to be something," Hauser said finally. "Yeah," Ethan said. "She is." The second visit was in April, when the transparency panels were being fitted. Modern materials that matched the original specifications as closely as current technology allowed, which Hauser had been particular about. He'd spent 6 weeks sourcing the right material and had turned down 2 vendors before finding the third, which told Ethan everything about the kind of work being done here. He brought Cora on the April visit. She was 8 now, taller, in the phase of growing that seems to happen while you're not watching. Ethan would look at her some mornings and think she'd been someone else the day before. She walked around the canopy slowly, the way he'd walked around it the first time at the auction, with the specific attention of someone measuring the distance between what they imagined and what the thing actually is. "It's bigger than I thought," she said. "You've seen it in the shop for months." "In the shop it looked broken," she said. "Now it looks like what it was supposed to be." Hauser looked at her with the respectful attention he gave to accurate observations regardless of their source. "That's exactly what we were going for." Cora looked at him. "Did you know the lady who built it?" "No," Hauser said. "But I know her work now, and her work is—" He paused, searching for the right word and being honest enough not to settle for a lesser one. "Her work is extraordinary. She solved problems in this frame that my team spent weeks just understanding, let alone replicating." Cora nodded, apparently satisfied. She looked at the canopy one more time. Eleanor would be glad, she said simply, and then asked if there was a vending machine because she was hungry. Ethan watched her walk with Hauser toward the break room and thought that 8-year-olds were right about more things than adults gave them credit for, mostly because they hadn't yet learned to qualify everything they believed. The museum was the Caldwell Aerospace Heritage Center, which had been undergoing its own expansion for 2 years and had agreed to house the permanent Area 7 exhibition as its centerpiece. The timing worked. The restoration would be complete in late September, which gave the museum 6 weeks to integrate the canopy into its installation before the October opening. Exactly 1 year, nearly to the week, after Ethan had stood in a field in Ransom Valley and raised a paper slip. He didn't think about that coincidence too hard. It wasn't the kind of thing you needed to make meaningful by thinking about it. It was already what it was. The exhibition design had been handled by a team that the Stellarian Foundation had assembled, with Dr. Adler overseeing the historical content and a design firm that specialized in immersive museum installations managing the physical space. Ethan had been consulted at 3 points in the process, not as a creative director, but as someone whose input mattered and whose conditions were contractually embedded in the structure of the whole thing. He'd been clear about what he wanted, the story told completely, the names given equal prominence, no narrative that centered the discovery at the expense of the work itself. The team had listened. He'd checked the draft content panels twice and found them accurate and appropriately weighted. The exhibition opened with Eleanor. Not with Aria 7, not with the discovery. With Eleanor. Her photograph large on the entrance wall, her name, her dates, her degrees, and a single line beneath her portrait that Ethan had suggested and that Dr. Adler had approved. She built something extraordinary, and she knew it would be found. The week before opening day, Ethan was at the museum overseeing the final placement of the canopy in the central gallery when Victoria arrived. She came through the main entrance in the late afternoon, when most of the installation crew had wrapped for the day, and she walked into the gallery and stopped. The canopy sat at the center of the space on a custom mount that positioned it at the angle of its original installation in the aircraft, nose slightly elevated, the way it would have looked to someone approaching from the front of the runway. The transparency panels caught the gallery lighting and threw faint geometric shadows across the floor. The hidden compartment door was mounted open, hinged in its original position, the empty cavity visible, a deliberate part of the exhibition, the absence made present. Around it, on 3 walls, were the schematics, all 9 pages, enlarged and printed on archival quality materials, framed without glass, so the surface texture of the original drafting paper was visible in the high-resolution reproductions. The test team photograph was on the south wall, larger than life. The 11 people in their work clothes in front of the hangar, the handwriting on a mounted card beside it. Test team, final prep. We made it. Victoria stood in the middle of the space and looked at all of it, and Ethan watched her from near the canopy mount where he'd been checking the leveling with one of the installation crew. She didn't say anything for a while. He let her not say anything. "It's right," she said finally. "Almost," he said. "The north wall panel is 3 inches too high. We're fixing it tomorrow." She looked at the north wall panel. Then she looked at him with an expression that was exasperated and amused at the same time, which was a combination he'd learned she fell into when she was genuinely caught off guard. "I meant the overall—" "I know what you meant," he said. "I'm fixing the panel first." She shook her head, but the almost smile was there. The real one. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" Tomorrow was the preview event. Sal Ferretti and the families of the other team members, Daniel Holt, Sterling, Renner, Dr. Adler, and a small group of aerospace historians invited for a private walkthrough before the public opening the following week. Ethan had been managing the logistics for the past 3 weeks in parallel with his actual work, which meant he'd been running on about 6 hours of sleep and too much coffee for most of October. "Tired," he said honestly, "ready for it to be done." She came to stand beside him near the canopy. The gallery was quiet in the late afternoon light. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Okay." "When you refused the first offer, the 8,000, I called Portman from the car and told him to keep pushing. I assumed you'd have a number." She paused. "And then you refused the second offer, and the third, and I started thinking that maybe you genuinely didn't have a number. And that scared me a little, because in my experience, people without a number are either saints or problems, and you didn't look like a saint. I'm definitely not a saint, Ethan said. No. She looked at the canopy. But you weren't a problem either. You were just honest about what you wanted, which was the truth about the thing. And I spent about 3 weeks trying to find the angle in that because I was convinced there had to be one. She paused. There wasn't. No, he said. There wasn't. She was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about what it costs to see things the way you saw this. To stop in front of something that looks wrong and ask why, instead of walking past. She turned to look at him. I move fast. I've always moved fast. It's gotten me further than most people get, but I've walked past a lot of things. You can't stop at everything, Ethan said. No, she said, but you can stop more than I have. He looked at her in the gallery light. She was being unusually direct, not the boardroom directness he'd gotten used to, which was precision deployed in service of a goal, but something more personal than that. Something she was working out in real time and choosing to do out loud. What are you going to do with that? He asked. I don't know yet. She looked back at the canopy. I'm working on it. A pause. You said that was the honest place to be. I did say that. So that's where I am. He nodded. He thought about saying something else and decided against it. Not everything needed to be resolved before its time. What? The preview the next day ran 3 hours. Sal Ferretti arrived first, again with his daughter, and he stood in the entrance gallery looking at Eleanor's portrait for a long time before he walked further in. When he finally saw the canopy in the central gallery, he made a sound that wasn't quite a word, just a sound, low and brief, the involuntary kind, and he didn't move for almost a minute. We built that, he said to his daughter very quietly, and then, slightly louder, to nobody and everybody. We actually built that. Daniel Holt was there. He moved through the exhibition slowly, reading every panel, stopping at the test team photograph for a long time, finding his mother's handwriting on the mounted card beside it. Test team, final prep. We made it. And standing with his hand near but not touching the glass, the way people stand near things they want to feel but understand they shouldn't touch. Ethan stood near him for a while without speaking. She was proud of this, Daniel said. Yes. She should have been able to say that out loud. He paused. She should have had the chance to walk someone through this, tell them what each piece was, explain what she solved and how. He looked at the schematics on the wall, the 9 pages of Eleanor's careful hand. She would have been good at that. She was a good teacher when she let herself be. Ethan thought about Eleanor sealing the documents on a Sunday afternoon. He thought about her choosing what to include, the schematics, the photographs, the identification plate. She'd curated the record herself. She'd been her own archivist, knowing she couldn't be anything else. She taught you, he said. Daniel looked at him. Even without telling you what she was working on, Ethan said. You said she came home tired and made dinner and asked about school. That's teaching too. That's showing someone what it looks like to do your work seriously and keep doing it even when it costs something. Daniel was quiet for a moment. I never thought about it that way. Cora said something to me once, Ethan said. She said Eleanor looked proud in the photograph. She was 7 when she said it. She didn't have a complicated analysis. She just looked at the picture and saw what was in it. Daniel looked at Eleanor's portrait across the gallery. She was proud, he said. Right up until the end, she was proud of the work, not of being recognized, of the work itself. He paused. I think she knew the difference. Ethan thought about that for the rest of the day. The families of Ruth Cannon and the 2 other deceased team members came separately. They'd never met each other before, and watching them find each other in the gallery and discover that they were all carrying variations of the same story, a parent who'd worked on something classified, who'd been quietly intense about a project they couldn't discuss, who died without that chapter of their life ever being acknowledged, was one of the stranger and more affecting things Ethan had witnessed in a year that had contained a lot of those. Ruth Cannon's daughter, whose name was Margaret, a coincidence that made Ethan think briefly of the librarian neighbor who'd sat at his workbench and read the schematics, Spent 20 minutes with Renner going through the documentation that referenced her mother. Renner had found Ruth Cannon's name in 3 separate internal records, crediting her with the propulsion system's integration work that had made Eleanor's design actually buildable. Margaret Cannon read those records with the kind of concentration that blocks out everything else, and when she looked up, her eyes were red, but her face was steady. She said it was the best job she ever had, Margaret told Renner. She said it mattered. She just couldn't say why. Sterling moved through the preview quietly, speaking to the families individually, spending time with each of them. Ethan watched him work the room, not with the smooth efficiency of someone performing contrition, but with the visible effort of a man who had something real to account for and was doing it personally, face to face, because anything less would have been an insult to the weight of it. He came to Ethan near the end of the afternoon. Ferretti told me he still has notes from the original test sessions, Sterling said. Handwritten logs. He kept them all this time. Renner will want those. I told him. Sterling paused. He also told me something else. He said my mother used to say when the program was going well that the best feeling in engineering isn't the moment when something works. It's the moment when you understand why it works, because then it belongs to you in a way that can't be taken. Ethan looked across the gallery at the canopy. She was right. She usually was, Sterling said. He looked at Ethan with the direct, unguarded steadiness that Ethan had come to understand was how Sterling looked when he wasn't performing anything. Thank you for all of it, for stopping, for refusing to sell it until you knew what it was, for the conditions. He paused, for making it impossible to do this halfway. You were going to do it right, Ethan said. Eventually. I don't know that. Sterling said it plainly, without self-pity. I'd been finding reasons not to for 40 years. I might have found another 40. He paused. You took the choice out of my hands. I'm grateful for that. Ethan looked at him. How does it feel? Having it out there? Sterling considered the question seriously. Like setting something down that you've been carrying so long you forgot it was heavy, he said. And then your arms hurt for a while because that's what happens when you stop carrying something. The hurt isn't bad. It just means something real happened. Ethan nodded. He understood that feeling from a different direction. The specific ache of a thing you've worked on hard finally leaving your hands and going where it was supposed to go. Public opening day was a Saturday in mid-October, and the line outside the Caldwell Aerospace Heritage Center stretched around the block by 9 in the morning, 45 minutes before doors. Ethan stood near the entrance with Cora, who was wearing her good jacket and had her hair done in the way she only submitted to for important occasions. 2 braids, which she'd allowed her mother to do the evening before. She was looking at the line of people with the focused curiosity she brought to things she was deciding how to feel about. That many people came, she said. That many people came. She thought about this. Because of Eleanor. Because of the whole story that, he said. The aircraft. The team. What got buried and what got found. She looked at the line again. Eleanor would still hate the fuss, she said. Ethan laughed. A real one. The kind that arrives before you can manage it. Probably, he said. But I think she'd be okay with people knowing what she built. Cora considered this and nodded, apparently having made the distinction and found it satisfactory. Victoria arrived at 9:30, coming through the staff entrance and finding Ethan in the main corridor. She was wearing something less formal than her usual work clothes, still put together, but with the slightly more human quality of someone who'd dressed for something they were attending rather than running. She looked, Ethan thought, like herself, whatever that fully was. How's the north wall panel? She asked. Fixed. Good. She looked at the growing crowd in the atrium. This is going to be something. Already is, he said. She turned to Cora. You must be the one who said Eleanor looked proud. Cora looked up at her, evaluating. Dad told you that. He did, Victoria said. He tells it like it's one of the most important things anyone said to him in the last year. Cora looked at Ethan, who did not react, because he had nothing to add to that. I just looked at the picture, Cora said. It wasn't complicated. No, Victoria said, and something in her voice had the quality of something genuinely landed. It wasn't. Cora seemed to decide Victoria was acceptable and went back to watching the line. Victoria stood beside Ethan, and they looked at the atrium filling with people, which was the kind of thing that doesn't require comment. "I've been thinking about what you said," Ethan said after a moment, "about moving fast and walking past things." She looked at him. "I think you're being harder on yourself than you need to be," he said. "You told me about Daniel Holt when you didn't have to. You came to the shop in person instead of sending Portman. You contributed to the scholarship fund before anyone asked." He paused. "You notice things. You just need to slow down long enough to let the noticing mean something." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous reading." "It's an accurate one," he said. "There's a difference." She held his gaze for a moment. A real one, the kind where both people know something is being communicated that isn't in the words. Then she looked away, back at the atrium, the way she did when something got close to the edge of what she was ready for. He understood that. He had his own edges. The first group through the exhibition came out 40 minutes later, and the thing Ethan noticed was the quiet. Not silence. People were talking, pointing, reading the panels, but the particular quality of quiet that comes over people when they're in the presence of something that matters. The way people get in spaces where a real story has been told completely. He stood near the central gallery and watched people encounter the canopy. He watched them stop in front of Eleanor's portrait at the entrance. He watched them stand at the test team photograph and read the handwriting on the card. He watched a man about his age point something out to his teenage son on sheet 4 of the schematics, the engine configuration, the one that had been 15 years ahead of everything else. And the son bent forward and looked, really looked, in the way young people look at something that has suddenly made a subject feel real rather than theoretical. That, he thought, that right there. He found Renner in the afternoon near the display of Ruth Cannon's personal notes, which had been incorporated into the exhibition with Margaret Cannon's permission. Renner was speaking with one of the Aerospace Journal editors who had come to cover the opening. Later, when the editor had moved on, Renner came to stand beside Ethan. "I've been doing this work for 30 years, Renner said. He said it without preamble, the way he said most things. Historical recovery, finding the pieces of the record that got lost or buried or deliberately erased. Some of it matters more than other pieces." "This one mattered," Ethan said. "This one mattered in a particular way," Renner said. He looked at the exhibition around them. "Because it wasn't just about correcting the record. It was about returning something to the people it belonged to. Eleanor's son, Sal Ferretti, Ruth Cannon's daughter." He paused. "That doesn't happen very often. Most of the time you recover a historical fact and put it in a journal and it lives there. This," he looked at the canopy in the central gallery, "this is in the world. Because someone sealed documents in a titanium wall and hoped," Ethan said. "Because someone sealed them and someone else stopped to ask why the proportions were off," Renner said. He looked at Ethan with the direct, unblinking attention of a man who said what he meant. "Don't undercount your part in this." Ethan looked at the canopy. He thought about what it cost to stop. Not in the heroic sense. He hadn't done anything heroic. He'd bought a piece of junk at an auction because something about it didn't add up, and he'd refused to sell it before he understood what it was, and he'd wanted a dead woman's name to be on her own work. These were not dramatic acts. They were just choices, made in sequence, each one following from the one before it with the plain logic of doing what you said you were going to do. He'd been lucky, too. He knew that. He'd been in the right place. He'd had $400 in his account, and $250 he'd given himself permission to spend. And the lot he'd actually come to buy had gone too high in the first 5 minutes. And so he'd been standing at the outer edge of the field with nothing to do when the auctioneer got to lot 42C, and a thing that had been waiting 50 years for someone to look at it carefully had been sitting 20 feet away. Luck. And then the choice to do something with it. He thought about Eleanor on that Sunday afternoon in the hangar with Ferretti and Ruth Cannon, sealing the documents behind the sealant, hoping like hell someone would eventually open it. She'd had no guarantee. She'd had no way of knowing whether the canopy would survive, whether the compartment would hold, whether the right person would be in the right field on the right October Tuesday, half a century later. She'd done it anyway, because the work was good and she knew it, and that was enough reason. He thought that was worth something. Worth a lot, actually. The decision to believe the work is good enough to survive, even when you can't see how. He found Cora in the late afternoon, sitting on a bench in the hallway outside the central gallery. She'd been through the exhibition twice. He'd seen her the second time moving through slowly, reading the panels with the serious attention she gave to things she'd decided mattered. And now she was drawing in the small sketchbook she'd started carrying everywhere. He sat down beside her. She showed him the drawing without being asked. It was the canopy, rendered in pencil with the careful observation she brought to things she was interested in. The shape of the frame, the open compartment door, the mount. It wasn't perfect. The proportions were slightly off in one place, and she'd erased and redrawn the forward edge twice. But it was clearly the thing it was trying to be. "It's good," he said. "The forward edge is wrong," she said. "I can't get the curve right." "Keep working on it." She looked at the drawing critically, then looked at the entrance to the gallery from where she could see the edge of the canopy on its mount. She studied it for a moment and made a small adjustment with her pencil. "Better," she said. He watched her work. 8 years old, sitting on a museum bench, drawing an aircraft that a woman had designed 50 years ago and that had been found in a field and restored and was now sitting in a gallery with Eleanor's name on it, finally, permanently, irrevocably. He thought about what Eleanor would make of this. Not the ceremony or the exhibition or the $52 million, but this. A kid on a bench, drawing her aircraft because it was interesting and the curve was hard to get right. He thought she'd have found that exactly right. He stood in the central gallery as the last visitors moved through at closing. The installation crew was doing final checks. The museum staff moved quietly through the space. The gallery was settling into the particular quiet of a place after people have been in it. Still inhabited, still warm, the conversations and reactions soaked into the air. Victoria found him there. She always seemed to know where to find him in a room, which he'd stopped questioning. They stood beside the canopy together, the way they'd stood beside it in his shop months ago, and looked at it in the gallery light. "1 year ago," she said, "I was standing in a field in Ransom Valley, watching a lot of overfed collectors bid on turbine housings. And I was trying to figure out what to do with 250. And neither of us had any idea." She paused. "That seems like a long time ago." "It was a long time ago," he said. "A lot happened." She looked at the canopy. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something for about 3 months. He waited. "I misjudged you at the auction," she said. "I know I've said that, but what I mean by it now is different from what I meant the first time I said it." She paused. "The first time I made a professional error in evaluating an asset, which is true, but isn't the whole thing." She looked at him. "What I mean now is, I looked at you and made a decision about who you were before I knew anything real about you. And the reason I did that is the same reason I looked at that canopy for 15 seconds and walked away. I was moving fast, and I trusted my first impression because my first impressions are usually right, and it's efficient to act on them." She stopped. "But being right 90% of the time means being wrong 10% of the time. And the 10% you're wrong about tends to be the things that matter most. Because the things that look like junk are the ones you dismiss fastest, and sometimes the junk is where everything is." He looked at her. "That's the most words I've heard you say at once." "I've been practicing," she said dryly. He almost smiled. "I misjudged you too," he said. "At the auction, I saw someone in expensive shoes who thought it was funny that I was buying worthless scrap. I decided you were someone who moved through the world measuring everything by what it cost." He paused. "You're more complicated than that." "A little," she said. "I'm still working on it." "I know," he said. I know." They stood there in the gallery quiet, and the canopy sat between them and all around them. Eleanor's work made whole and present and finally named. The compartment door was open, the hiding place empty. Everything that had been sealed inside it was out in the world now, in the panels and the records and the scholarship fund and the names on the walls. Something had been set right. Not everything. The world doesn't work that cleanly, and 50 years of a buried record doesn't fully unhappen just because the record gets corrected. But something real had shifted, and the shift was permanent, and that was enough. He looked at Victoria. She was looking at the canopy, and then she looked at him, and neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. There's a point in certain things where the words stop being the important part and the presence is what matters. Just being in the same place at the same time with the same understanding of what happened here and what it cost and what it was worth. That was where they were. He wasn't sure exactly what it was going to be. He thought she wasn't either. He thought they were both the kind of people who needed to be sure before they said something out loud, which meant it would take time, and time was fine. He had a shop to expand, apprentices to hire, a truck that was finally fixed. She had a company to run and a way of seeing the world to recalibrate. They were both busy, both flawed, both in the middle of working things out. But they were in the same room. They kept ending up in the same room. And neither of them was walking away. Cora's drawing of this canopy went up on the wall at home, next to Eleanor's portrait photograph, which Ethan had kept a copy of. He'd had it properly framed at some point in the last few months. Not a fancy frame, just a clean one. The kind that says this matters and deserves to be treated accordingly. In the morning, before school, Cora would sometimes stand in front of the two things on the wall, her drawing and Eleanor's photograph, and look at them with the quiet, evaluative attention she brought to things she was still deciding about. Ethan didn't know exactly what she was thinking when she did that. He didn't ask. Some things belonged to the person thinking them, but he understood, watching her, that she was learning something from it, something about what it means to make something carefully, something about the distance between doing the work and getting the credit, and why the first one matters more than the second. Something about the kind of person who seals their best work in a hidden compartment and trusts that eventually the right person will stop and look and ask the right question. He hoped she'd learned it. He thought she had. Here's what he believed, standing in his expanded shop on a November morning a year after the auction, with two apprentices in the back and a truck that no longer made any sounds at all, with Eleanor's photograph on the wall and the Caldwell exhibition open to the public, and a scholarship program with a $10 million endowment that was going to send working-class kids into engineering programs for decades. The things that matter most almost never look like what they are at first. They look like damaged junk on a pair of pallets. They look like a person who's too tired to explain themselves. They look like a job that isn't paying what it should. They look like a life smaller than the one the person inside it was built for. Most people walk past, not because they're cruel, not because they're stupid, because it's efficient to trust the first impression, because time is short, because the thing doesn't look like what it is, and the cost of stopping to look again is real. It takes something, a particular kind of stubbornness or patience, or just the habit of asking why when something is slightly off, to stop in front of the wrong thing and say, wait, let me understand this first. Ethan Cross was not special. He had money problems and a truck that made noises and a small shop and a daughter he was raising on his own and a life that was genuinely harder than it needed to be some months. He was not an expert in anything except the specific work in front of him. He was not particularly brave or wise. He was just someone who had learned, somewhere along the way, to stop in front of things that seemed wrong and ask why before moving on. That was it. That was the whole thing. It was enough. It had been more than enough. He picked up his tools and got back to work, and in the corner of the shop where the wall met the ceiling, Eleanor's photograph looked out over everything with that expression that Cora had named correctly the first time she saw it. Proud. Quietly, permanently, correctly proud. The work was good. It had always been good. Now everyone knew.